This is Katelynn Richardson with Campus Reform. Today I'm here with Jeremy Wayne Tate, the founder and CEO of the CLT, an alternative to the SAT and ACT. Jeremy, thank you for joining us.
Katelynn, thanks so much for having me.
The CLT stands for the Classical Learning Test, so I wanted to ask you a little bit more about classical education and how that differs from what we typically see in most public schools today.
That's a great question. And it's actually the classic learning test rather than the classical. And there's a little bit of a difference there. And so I think what we wanted to convey by classic is tried and true, right? Putting students in front of the most important texts that have been most foundational in America's great story, in the story of the West as well. And so, when a student goes to take the SAT and the ACT, what are they actually reading? And it's kind of a wild story because part of what has happened is these companies have what they call sensitivity committees. And maybe this was a good intention, a goodwill thing at one point, but the sensitivity committees have gotten really, really out of control. And the idea is that it's going to be a distraction to a student if they have to read something that's offensive when they're testing. And then they're not going to be able to test well. And it's not even going to be an accurate assessment of where they're at, right? And so the idea is that you shouldn't put anything offensive in front of students. And this has gone so far now, right, that you can't have things like married parents, right, on a standardized test, because this would be disturbing to children of maybe divorced parents or maybe single parent homes. You can't have a gender, right? I'm talking the mainstream testing establishment, because that would be maybe upsetting to a non-binary student or something, right? It's gotten to an extreme where you end up with the most random, meaningless passages imaginable on the most important tests that students ever take, right? And so the idea with CLT was, well, what if instead of reading these new boring passages about, I've seen passages about mustard or actually a vacuum cleaner manual, or penguins in Antarctica is a good one, because apparently penguins in Antarctica don't offend people at all, so they're safe to use those. But what if instead students were reading, John Locke? What if they were reading Frederick Douglass? What if they were reading passages from Plato's Republic, right? Think about that for a minute. That could have a huge impact, right? And right now there is a massive disconnect between the kind of education that 100% of America's founders had, right? Which was a classical education. And I want to talk for a moment about what that really means, right? 100% of America's founders had a classical education. That means a couple of things. One, it means education for them. It meant transmission, right? It was a transmission of a body of knowledge. It was a transmission as well of cultural and moral values, right? For them, school wasn't just about learning things. It was fundamentally about being shaped into a responsible, moral agent. Okay. And there was a connection that is long been the case in classical education between human freedom and being a person of good moral character, right? There's this paradox, like with the disciplines actually comes more freedom, not less freedom, right? Whereas mainstream education, there's a new view of freedom, which is basically autonomy. Students are never even told, hey, the view that we're teaching you of human freedom is totally different than what most humans meant when they understood freedom for most of human history, right? They're just kind of given this new definition in a way without any context at all. The other thing that classical education means as well is that you're not a product of your own generation, right? All of America, the genius of America is that all of our founders were deeply read. They knew the pitfalls and the strengths of every political system. They were well read in the very best of Enlightenment political philosophy. They were well read in Plato's Republic, in the great classics, and they could view historically where empires of old went wrong and how you could have checks and balances in place to prevent the kind of corruption and abuses that led to the collapse of former empires before us. All of this is baked into the American system of government, and it's baked in because of this kind of education, classical education that our founders had. And I think hopefully a growing percentage of Americans are becoming more aware of like, oh, wow, we've gone away from classical education and we've embraced what I describe as secular progressive education, or utilitarian education. And in this model, the main focus is not how do we form a virtuous human? The main focus is how do we get this kid to be employable or college ready, in 12 years. So the great paradox with this, or the great irony, is that these classical schools, and now you've got waves of these classical schools coming out of places like the Founders Schools and Great Hearts and all these classical charters and tons of classical Christian schools and Catholic schools re-embracing this tradition. The irony is that even though their intention is not to make a young person college or career ready, the intention instead is helping to cultivate virtue and human freedom in a young person, they end up making the most exceptional college students ever, the most exceptional employees ever.
So as we see people moving out of certain schools, what do you think the purpose of education is, just broadly?
This is a great question, Katelynn. I love this question. Yes, totally. My last year or two teaching, and I was doing this not to be a weirdo teacher because I was trying to figure it out. And so like the first day of school, I would ask my students, like, let's talk about this. Like, honestly, like, why are we here? What are we doing here? What's the point? Right. And almost every student would say, to get a better job. Right. I'm like, that is really depressing if you think about it, right? It's so utilitarian, it's so dehumanizing. It's just to get a better job, to go be a cog in a big economic machine. So what I would do then is I would write on the chalkboard, the object of education is to learn to love what is beautiful. It's a quote from Plato, right? And the students will look at that like, what, right? So the purpose of education, and this is what it's always been, right? And I believe this is Aristotle. It's teaching the student to love what he ought to love truth, to love goodness, to love beauty, to love justice, right? It's about shaping the affections. It's about cultivating virtue. It's about building moral character. It's about building a moral imagination, inspiring young people towards heroic virtue. This is the purpose of education. And it's sad that this has been almost entirely lost in mainstream K-12 right now.
That's fascinating. I definitely see that significantly moving away from that in K-12. And it's not that we're not teaching any values, right? It's just that they're what you talked about before, that secular progressivism. When do you think that shift happened?
Yeah, great question. And so I think it was a slow transition. Right. And so I think even 100 years ago, it was pretty much still kind of classical education is what we were doing, but it was so slow that it was hard for anybody to know to object to it. Right. Like if somebody just would have said, like pre-Civil War or something, hey, we should get logic and classical languages and grammar. We should just get that out of education and religion. Let's just get it out of education. People would be like, then what would education be? Like, what would it even be? You couldn't even, our founders could not conceive of education divorced from religion, from moral formation, from logic, grammar, rhetoric, classical languages, philosophy, right? It would not have made any sense at all. And so it was a very slow transition over the course of the 20th century from classical education towards secular, modern, progressive education, with these kind of lofty utilitarian ends, which kind of justify, right? And so, we're not doing classical anymore. Well, why not? Because we've got to prepare our kids for a complex 21st century global economy, right? Nonsense. Okay, the economy has been global for centuries now. Okay, things haven't changed that much that an entirely different kind of education should replace what has always been understood to be a good education.
So what do you think the future looks like for education? How do we move past a lot of the problems we're seeing right now?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a bifurcating of education. I think CLT has played an important role even in that right now as well. And so I think parents are kind of having to decide. And it used to be that the choice was public school or private school. I think that the choice is becoming classical, or we could call it traditional. I think there's a lot of overlap there. Classical or traditional education versus modern secular progressive education, because a lot of private schools are doing the same thing. Okay. And then you also have some public schools, especially the classical charters, as we mentioned, that are doing traditional education. And so then I think we've got to, in 10 or 20 years, compare the fruit, right, of each kind of education. Who is creating better doctors and better lawyers, better nurses, better teachers? I think that's going to be really clear. And look, you meet the very best kind of argument for a classical education is really just meeting these young people, right, that have had this kind of education. And I always want to be very careful not to, to say that in a way that bashes public school students. I did meet some amazing public school students, amazing families, amazing teachers. I taught there for 10 years. But you meet some of these students that have had a great classical or classical Christian education, and it's like shocking. I meet some of these people, I'm like, really? Like a young person of 14 or 15 can be like this? And so I think when parents see their friends and the way that their friends' kids have been shaped by this kind of education. And so this movement is rapidly scaling, the renewal movement, and so hundreds of thousands every year, students are being pulled out of the public school system, and they're being put into a classical charter or a Catholic school or a Christian school or a homeschool. I mean, you look at just homeschooling alone, in the past 2 years, we've seen 5x growth among Black Americans who are homeschooling, right? From 3% to over 16%. And that's just in 2 years, And what they're doing is they're often favoring a more traditional, more clearly Christian kind of education than what's being offered in public schools. And look, the differences are night and day. When I was in public schools, we talked a lot about the achievement gap. The greatest achievement gap in American education, you know what it is? It's actually Black homeschooled students compared to Black public school students, okay? That on testing, there is night and day difference for the kind of academic formation these homeschool students are receiving.
Where can students who maybe want to take the CLT, where can they find more information about it?
Yeah, cltexam.com. The cool thing about the CLT itself is you don't have to go to a testing site. Juniors and seniors in high school that take the CLT, they literally take it from their house. They take it from their basement or from their kitchen. It is remotely proctored via video technology. It's amazingly brilliant technology that we can use. But look, it means that you don't have to get up and go to a testing site. And it means you get your results back really quickly instead of the long delay that we're used to with the SAT and the ACT.
Thank you for joining us. It was great to talk to you.
Katelynn, thanks so much for having me.